thank you everybody for coming to this talk. It is really an update of a talk I gave for International Women's Day 2 years in a row, 2019 and 2020. And the content is mainly talking about women at Peabody and also women in the wider world of early history of housing provision. And I have added a little bit of new material at the end, but I'm not attempting to cover more recent history of women in housing. It's more the earlier years. Next slide. Here's our founder in the middle as a young man, and either side of him the two girls at different stages of his life he hoped to marry, but disappointed on both occasions. So he remained a bachelor, but he was very close to his mother and his sisters. He had vowed to become a philanthropist at quite an early age if he became sufficiently wealthy. He had progressive views in some respects. He founded a number of different organisations in America, as well as Peabody Trust in London, and he stipulated that religion and politics were not to have any influence in the running of those organisations. And when he founded the Peabody Education Fund in the southern states of America, he also stipulated that all races were to benefit equally. However, for every new enterprise, he only ever selected men to be his trustees. So no women ever held senior office in any Peabody organisation at an early date, as far as I can understand. Next. Well, for many decades, all the staff at Peabody were also exclusively male. That's as well as the board members that ran the organisation. This is a group photo from 1911. Now, many of those men fought in the First World War. They had previously, most of them, been in the armed services. The Peabody used to recruit its superintendents and porters from men from the Army and Navy, mostly those who had long service awards. That may account for the very handsome moustaches that so many of them are sporting, but they were felt to be good at keeping order and enforcing the rules. And also, of course, they had good service pensions, which rather compensated for the fairly modest salaries that they were paid by Peabody. But when the First World War broke out, men who had previously been in the armed services got recalled to the ranks, and later on more of them were obliged to sign up. So for a time during the First World War, the wives of the superintendents and porters had to cover their husbands' roles on a temporary basis. But that soon ended when the war finished and the men came back from the Western Front. It should be said that porters' wives were, in a sense, employed in that they were paid a small allowance because they were required to supervise the communal bathhouses during the sessions that were reserved for female tenants, because obviously in a communal bathhouse you couldn't have a ladies' bath night superintended by a male porter. But that was the only sense in which women were working for Peabody at an early stage. Next slide. Now, in 1932, there was a very small head office team, and there were two people who were joint managers. One of them died suddenly, and they had to find a replacement. And this is an extract from a letter about trying to find somebody suitable. And you'll see here that they were talking about interviewing Mr. McNabb, saying that the Duke, he was the chairman, agrees with me that a gentleman is essential. And there's other reference to the necessity of employing a gentleman. In other words, not just a man, but also a man of the right social class. No consideration whatsoever being given to the possibility of a woman being appointed. So that was 1932. And in the next slide, you'll see this is from 1957. This is Mr. McNabb, still in his senior post, writing about the workings of the trust and saying that in 95 years there has only been one woman superintendent. It is considered that a man is best suited for the work. So still very much a male-orientated team. Now, when I joined Peabody at the end of you've gone ahead, can you go back? Thank you. When I joined Peabody at the end of 1992, superintendents had recently had their title updated to estate manager, and the porters had been renamed as caretakers. And by then there were several female estate managers, but that was a fairly recent innovation. And I was told that Maureen Boutell, who was then still an estate manager, was the first woman estate manager. That isn't quite correct, because we know from what Mr. McNabb wrote here that there had been a woman superintendent at an earlier date, but I had no evidence of who she was or when it was, and it's only very recently that some researchers actually uncovered her story, which I'll come to towards the end of my talk. Next slide. This is 1962, the year that Peabody Trust was 100 years old. Still struggling to consider women as suitable. This was at board level. A suggestion was made that a member of the Socialist Party or a woman should be considered a suitable opportunity. It sounds as though they were dealing with two rather dangerous minorities there. But it was still another 22 years before they appointed the first woman board member, Lady Tompkins. So progress was pretty slow. Now, in the next slide, we'll see one of the early pioneers of social housing, and this time we have got a woman, a rough contemporary of George Peabody, Angela Burdett Coutts. She was personally known to George Peabody and Charles Dickens and many other influential people at the time. She inherited a huge fortune through Coutts Bank, and she gave vast amounts of her fortune to a range of good causes, and that included trying to help with the earliest provision of social housing in London at Columbia Buildings in Bethnal Green. And in the next slide, you'll see a drawing of the Columbia Market Building in the centre, and I think it's the dwellings at the side. They weren't a huge success. Londoners didn't really like market stalls to be in a big hall like that. They preferred the open street markets. And as for the housing, it had some drawbacks because fresh air was thought to be beneficial for the residents. They deliberately made all the doors and windows loose fitting so they had drafts going through, but of course that didn't make for very comfortable living. So all those properties have been demolished, but it was an early example of social housing provision funded by a woman. And coincidentally, the architect who designed them was Henry Derbyshire, who then went on to design all the 19th century blocks for Peabody. In the next slide, we'll see another housing pioneer, a female this time, another female, Octavia Hill, well known beyond the field of housing because she worked tirelessly for several good causes. But when it came to housing, she disapproved of the practice of Peabody and some other leading housing providers who routinely bought large sites, completely cleared them and built multiple blocks of flats. Octavia Hill didn't like that system. Her method was to buy small properties that were in a poor state of repair, renovate them, and turn them into affordable rented housing. And she also employed women managers from an early stage because she felt that they were good at getting to know the tenants personally and perhaps seeing problems before they really developed into major issues and stemming things at an early stage, so that that was beneficial for the residents. And after the early efforts of repairing existing properties, she then went on to develop new housing, but again she followed that little cottage design, not the big housing block. And these cottages, Red Cross cottages in Southwark, are actually not a very great distance from our main office at Westminster Bridge Road. Next slide. Now, another friend of Octavia Hill was Caroline Emilia Stephen. She was the niece of the novelist Virginia Woolf. She was inspired by Octavia Hill to put some of her own money into constructing Hereford buildings in Old Church Street in Chelsea. They were completed in 1878. I have been to see that property, very interesting and very attractive little development in a lovely location. But only 3 years after the property was completed, Caroline Stephen became a Quaker, and she felt that she needed to devote her attention more to matters directly relevant to her Quaker faith. So she relinquished the property to Octavia Hill. Eventually, it passed into the ownership of family Mosaic, and so through the merger with Peabody, it is now one of the heritage properties in our collection, an early example, and contemporaneous with some of our own earliest properties. Next slide shows Henrietta Barnett, another person who was influenced by Octavia Hill. She was married to Canon Samuel Barnett, who was a parish priest in Whitechapel. They founded the first of the university settlements at Toynbee Hall, which of course is still flourishing today. The two of them worked tirelessly in the East End of London, where there was widespread deprivation, not so much perhaps a famous figure in housing, but certainly in philanthropy in poor areas of London generally. And in the next slide, we see a property in New Kent Road, again, not very far from our Westminster Bridge Road office, quite distinctive piece of architecture. And the person who was responsible for this was Ada Lewis. She was the wife of Samuel Lewis, and he had founded a housing trust very similar to Peabody. You've probably heard of the Lewis Trust and Lewis Trust buildings. And Ada took an interest in the particular housing needs of women, which is what led to the construction of Driscoll House. Now, going back to Peabody, in the next slide, we see an extract from the annual report of 1911. This lists, it says the employment of tenants, but in fact, it was only the head of the household in each dwelling. The figures were compiled by carrying out a regular census throughout all the tenanted properties. Of course, it doesn't reflect the occupation of adult children who are still living with their parents, but also working. You've only got the head of the household. But it should be remembered that quite a lot of households were headed by women, single women or widows. There was no stipulation that the head of a household had to be a man. So as you can see, there were quite a substantial number of women in roles that are obviously female, like charwomen and laundresses and needlewomen and so on. And for some of the other jobs as well, it is possible that the mixture of men and women, certainly box makers, which is on the left-hand column, about 5 or 6 items down. Box making was something that quite a number of women did, but we can't be certain whether that number covers men or women, perhaps both. But as I say, from the numbers on the right-hand side, you can tell that there were large numbers of women, but in perhaps a few fairly limited domestic roles. But as I said, the grown-up children of some of the earliest residents, they were benefiting from the better housing in which their families were living. That meant an improvement in people's health generally. And from 1870 onwards, elementary education was improving. So the children of the earliest residents were probably healthier and better educated, so they were getting better jobs. So from the 1911 census, in the next slide, I've been able to extract some examples of some of the jobs that unmarried adult daughters were doing by then. So you can see that jobs like pupil teacher, shorthand typist, bookbinder, telephone operator, typist, they were all jobs that probably their mothers could not have aspired to. In the next slide, we see an example of one of the communal laundry rooms. This was at the top of a block at the Stamford Street estate. The flats were too small to enable people to do their laundry in their own accommodation. In fact, they didn't have sinks because there were shared sinks on the landings. There was no plumbing within the flats themselves, but there were these communal laundry rooms. So I think it must have been a mostly female preserve, and you can imagine the women all getting together, doing their laundry and having a good old gossip at the same time. It does rather lead me to wonder, what about the men who were tenants on their own? Single men, widowers, they needed laundry done too. Did they creep up there and try to do their laundry at times when there were no women around? We just don't know. But I think the laundry was very much a female-dominated area. And in the next slide, we can see that this is a washing roster from Stamford Street, that same estate, 1895, lists all the flats just in one block, to telling them which day they can do their laundry. And as you can see, there's a written remark on the form that the rules are to be put in force whenever tenants cannot agree among themselves as to their washing days. So you get the feeling that perhaps he was a little bit exasperated that he was being asked to referee who could do the washing when. In the next slide, you'll see one of the last remaining drying rooms on an estate. This is the Fulham estate, which had been built in 1912. And as well as laundry facilities, there were these drying racks, and there's one of the residents there pulling out one of the drying racks on which she's put her wet laundry. What you did was you pushed it in, there was heating behind the drying racks, I think in hot water pipes, and so your washing got nice and dry that way. Now, when Peabody was sticking firmly to employing only men, other housing providers were more forward-looking, and women were seeing housing management as a career opportunity. And in the next slide, we're going to the Tachbrook Estate in Pimlico. It was built from 1935 onwards by the Westminster Housing Trust. That organisation was set up by a lot of wealthy residents of the city of Westminster who felt the need to tackle an area of slum housing in Pimlico. They raised money, set up the housing trust, built the estate both before and after the Second World War, many blocks there. It was the only estate they ever built, and I think because of limited funding and concerns about a possible subsidence problem, which in fact didn't come to anything, they felt that they couldn't continue as an individual housing trust. So that's how Peabody acquired the estate in 1972. But what is significant from the point of view of today's talk is that right from the start, when the first blocks opened, the estate manager was a woman, Emilia Murray. And here she is at the time of her retirement in 1951, when she unveiled a plaque to commemorate the fact that she had seen very long service there. And in the next slide, you'll see her successor. This is on the occasion of Princess Margaret visiting the estate when they completed the last blocks in 1953. So Princess Margaret's there holding the flowers, but behind her in the dark hat is Eileen Wright, and she replaced Emilia Murray. And she continued to manage the estate for some years after Peabody took it over. And I have heard, I think not directly from a Touchbrook resident, but certainly secondhand from a member of staff who's talked to Touchbrook residents who go back a long way, that Miss Wright's word was law. So I think we had two very formidable ladies in succession running the Tachbrook estate in its days under its previous ownership. Tachbrook was in fact a very interesting estate in its own right. It was a leap forward in several ways. It was developed in cooperation with Westminster Council. It had a wealth of community facilities which at that time Peabody estates wouldn't have. There were workshops for the residents, there was a community hall with a grand piano, there was a nursery school, and in the next slide you see a painting of a building which is not actually on the estate. The only estate building there is the small portion you can see on the right-hand edge of a building with a brown frontage, but the building in the centre was developed at exactly the same time and designed by the same architect who designed the Tachbrook estate itself. But it was developed as a maternity and child welfare centre. So another great facility, all constructed and opened at the same time as the Tachbrook Estate. Now, I've mentioned that for the First World War, we know by repute that women filled the jobs of men who went off to the front, so they had to deal with managing some of the Peabody estates and doing the portering roles. When it comes to the Second World War, as we can see from the next slide, we've got more evidence because we have war diaries for every single estate. There was a weekly report back to head office from the estate superintendent as to what was happening on the estates. And there's lots of information about air raids and damage and sandbags and evacuation of children and so on. But I've just picked out entries here relating to the service of women. At this time, estates had a superintendent, several porters, and each estate also had somebody who was called the odd man. I think he was the one who really just did the odd jobs that were perhaps even beneath the porters to do. And so we get these strange references to a woman odd man. And we've got almost surprised comments about Mrs. A continues to do well. She continues to be a very satisfactory odd man. The superintendent is now assisted by 2 women odd men who run the boilers. And they, further down in 1943, continue to run the baths and laundries successfully. And by 1944, we've got the grand title Lady Porteress. The lady seems to manage the boilers without difficulty. I think he can hardly get over his surprise that a woman can actually do a job like that. Now, in the next slide, I'm just going to go back to George Peabody himself, or rather to one of his friends. He had quite a wide circle of friends, one of whom was John Bright, a leading social reformer and a great parliamentarian. And among other things, he supported the Reform Act of 1867, and that gave certain men from the working classes the right to vote. But there were also attempts to extend the franchise to women, and that took much longer to achieve. But in the next slide, we can see 2 people who were active in 1866 when the first petition went to Parliament to get the vote for women. It was signed by 1,500 people. One of the pioneers in that was Emily Davis, who was notable in the field of education as founder of Girton College, but she worked with John Stuart Mill, who was a very progressive member of Parliament at the time, and he was actively campaigning for women to get the vote. And of course, John Stuart Mill lives on in Peabody's records because in the next slide, you see Stuart Mill House and the King's Cross Estate, a much more modern building, of course, but it owes its name to the fact that John Stuart Mill had been born in nearby Rodney Street. So that's another good tie-in with the topic of women getting the vote. And we also know from 1 or 2 pieces of evidence that the female suffrage had support among the Peabody residents, because in the next slide, you'll see a news cutting from a publication called The Vote. That was a paper published for supporters of female suffrage. And you can see there that an event was being organised and advertised and tickets were being sold. And one of the places you could obtain tickets was from Peabody Estate. That was the Westminster Estate in Buckingham Gate. A Peabody resident was actually the secretary of the Women's Freedom League in 1913. And then in the next slide, we see the outcome of the long fight to get the vote for women, because by 1919, women could vote in parliamentary elections for the first time, although they had to be 30 years old, whereas men could vote at 21. But here we've got just an example, 1 page from an electoral register. This is for the Whitecross Street estate. So you can see there a mixture of men and women getting the vote. And it would be lovely to know how many of our female residents actually took the opportunity and went off to the polling station. I hope that there was a good turnout. I said earlier that Peabody not only had women as board members at long last by 1988, but eventually we also had a woman chair. And in the next slide, which was a photo taken exactly 10 years ago, when we had a service at Westminster Abbey to mark the 150th anniversary of our foundation, that's past and present chairs and chief executives of Peabody. And in the centre there is Pam Alexander, who was the first and so far only woman chair of Peabody's board. She served for 6 years. Now, like the Westminster Housing Trust, Family Mosaic and the various organisations which went to make up Family Mosaic through mergers were more progressive in their provision of housing services to meet the specific needs of women, and also in their board appointments. And in the next slide, we'll see some information about that. Family Mosaic was providing premises for women's refuges. There was a focus on fatherless households. They had a female chair long before Peabody did that. And the book, and more specifically the television programme Cathy Come Home, which focused very much on the vast problem of homelessness, was influential in foundation of the charity Shelter and in the ongoing work of Family Mosaic and its predecessor organisations. In the next slide, going back really to Octavia Hill and her influence, I said that from the outset she wanted to train women to manage her properties. And in the centre of this group, the lady with her hands behind her back, everybody's looking towards her, that is Maud Jeffrey. She had been trained in the system favoured by Octavia Hill, and she went on to train yet more women housing managers. And interestingly, this photograph is taken, you can see the address there, Cumberland Market, which is where there is now a large estate built by the Crown Estate Commissioners that passed into Peabody's ownership in 2011. I don't think that particular doorway is still there, but it's certainly on the site of our present day Cumberland Market estate. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll see somebody who was in turn influenced by Maud Jeffrey. So Maud Jeffrey, you can almost see the baton being passed from Octavia Hill to Maud Jeffrey, and from Maud Jeffrey to Margaret Hearn. I've only found out about this within the last few weeks, when somebody whose late husband had been a surveyor for the Crown Estate sent me copies of some documents and photographs from her late husband's collection at home. And that drew my attention to the existence of this plaque for the Margaret Hearn Gardens. But she, having trained under Maud Jeffrey, then obtained a post in housing management at Cumberland Market, and went on to serve at that estate for many years, and retired in 1980. So she is commemorated by that plaque. Now, I said that's something I've only found out about in recent weeks, and I'm going back to that interesting question of the first woman superintendent. There was that vague, rather cryptic reference in 1950 something to the fact that there'd been only ever been one woman superintendent. I had no clue as to who she was or where she'd served, but I've done a bit of digging, and I found a reference to her in an old book of board minutes. And more recently, I've looked at a retrospective list of estate superintendents and porters, and also at the 1921 census, which has only just been released at the start of this year. So in the next slide, sadly, we can't see the lady herself, we can only see her husband, and that's taken from that early big group photograph of all these superintendents in 1911. I cut him out, but that's William Pryor. And either side of his picture, I've got extracts. You probably can't see them properly, but I've put extracts. The left-hand one is Islington, and right at the top, and ruled out because she was succeeded by somebody else, Mrs. Pryor, date of joining January 1918. And on the right-hand side, Herbrand Street Estate, Mrs. Pryor, and she was certainly serving until the 1920s. So I've done some research on a genealogical website and found out more about her. Apparently in 1918, she took over as superintendent, not because her husband was on war service, but because he resigned because of the ill health of his daughter. But Eliza stepped into his shoes. By 1921, she was a widow. William had died. Their daughter, she may have been ill, but she recovered. But William himself died. But in 1921 census, which is the document at the bottom, she was still living in Block E at the Islington Estate. She described herself as superintendent, and that she was employed by the Peabody Nation Fund. The next record I found of her was in 1939. There was another document similar to a national census. By then, she was living in the Tottenham area, and she rather modestly described herself as caretaker, retired, which I think is rather understating what she would have had to do in her responsibilities as a Peabody Estate superintendent. I've also found on a genealogical website, somebody's uploaded a family tree. I don't know how reliable it is, but if what it says about her is true, she lived until 1964, which means that she was 96 years old when she died. So I think in all respects, she must have been quite a formidable lady. And I can't help thinking that perhaps her name ought to be better known. Perhaps as this is our 160th anniversary, we should do something to champion Eliza Pryor, the very first woman estate superintendent. We've got a number of buildings on various estates that we've named after notable people. We've got Victor Wilkins bungalows at Hammersmith Estate, named after the architect. We've got Derbyshire Place at Whitechapel Estate, named after another architect. We've got Hugh Cubitt Centre, named after one of our former chairmen, all named after men. Perhaps we should be thinking about naming a building after Eliza Pryor. By 1920, when the superintendents and porters had all returned from their war service, it was decided they would have an annual dinner. And in the next slide, you'll see the earliest such reunion dinner that I've got. As you can see, all men. I would love to have one of the earlier ones, but I very much doubt whether Eliza Pryor was invited. I can't help thinking that even if she qualified on the basis of being a superintendent, she would probably not asked to go. And my final slide relates to another very new story, although this is something that dates from last year, because about the middle of 2021, we were contacted by English Heritage asking for their permission to install one of their official blue plaques on a property in Hackney. They have been trying to increase the representation of women on the blue plaque scheme because the vast majority of blue plaques commemorate men. Now, this is a property, 26 King Edward Road, Hackney, which now belongs to Peabody, but I think at least 30 years ago, it was acquired by New Islington and Hackney Housing Association, which is one of the constituent organisations that made Family Mosaic, and therefore, through subsequent mergers, it's now become a Peabody property. Its interest from the point of view of English Heritage is that for just over 20 years, it was the location for what was called the Ayers home. They were based at several different properties in Hackney, but this is the only one that is still standing in its original form, so it's the only one where they could put a blue plaque. But Ayers were Indian and Asian nursemaids and nannies who helped look after the children of British residents in India at the time of the British Raj, And whenever the British families came home for a spell on furlough, the nannies and nursemaids would accompany them, but then they either got to find somewhere to stay until the family took them back, or they might even have been paid off by the British family and they needed accommodation where they could stay and try to find a new British family to take them on as employees and go on the voyage back to the Indian subcontinent. So I was engaged during the latter part of last year in a lot of correspondence with English Heritage and with neighbourhood staff about the feasibility of having a plaque installed. It's all been approved, and so here you can see two early photographs of the property, one the exterior with some ladies gathered in the front hall and in the front porch rather, and lower right a photograph taken inside, and the other picture is the approved design for the blue plaque, and the plan is to install it and unveil it in mid-June. That's not really a story about social housing in the sense of the rest of the content of my talk, but an interesting story in its own right, and an event for us to be proud of and to look forward to later in the year. So that concludes what I was going to say. I think I'm just about on time for the time allowance I was given, so we've got some time for questions afterwards. So back to you, Emma.
Thank you so much, Christine. That was absolutely fascinating to hear about all of the women's contributions through their time at Peabody throughout the ages. We are going to move on to a Q&A now, but yeah, I just wanted to firstly say what a fantastic way to kick off the Gender Network and International Women's Day event. So thank you so much, Christine, for all of that. It was absolutely, yeah, brilliant. I found it really, really interesting, and hopefully everyone else did. We've got some questions already coming through, but if you have a question that you are eager to ask, please pop it in the Q&A. And I will read it out. It's been interesting reading all of your reflections in the chat as well, but I'm going to start off with a question from Ellie for you, Christine. So Ellie's question was, here we go. Christine, could you share reflections on the main ways your role has evolved since 1992?
Yes, in 1992, there was only limited interest from the outside world, so to speak, in our history and archives, but it was not unusual for us to get inquiries from descendants of former residents who were doing family history research and wanted to know whether we got any information in our records about their ancestors. And at that time, I had another job anyway. My prime role was legal work, and I just did family history inquiries as a sort of bolt-on in my spare time. But over the years, interest in Peabody's history generally has grown. I've given up the legal work to concentrate solely on being a historian, and the scope of the inquiries I get is widening all the time. I get far more inquiries now from authors, academics, students, the media, TV, and the range of inquiries has widened a lot. I think there is a growing interest in the whole history of social housing, both from the point of view of the sort of social aspects, but also the architecture. The architecture of our older properties is becoming much more appreciated, and more people are wanting to include material on it in books that they publish. So there is huge variety in what I do, which makes it constantly fascinating job to do.
Mm. Thank you so much for that. We have a question that came through the Q&A. Who is a woman working in social housing today who you admire?
Well, sadly, because I'm dealing with the history of the organisation, and indeed to some extent have to know quite a bit about the history of other housing organisations, I find it almost impossible to keep up with what's going on in the housing world today, which is why I don't attempt to cover the topic in my talk. I mean, I'm going back well over back to 160 years and more. So it is, much as I try to keep up with stories that appear on the pod about what people are achieving in their present day jobs, I don't think I could name anybody, but something I do always try to read and follow is the work of our colleagues in care and support, because I'm lost in admiration for what they do for some of the people who need, so much focused attention.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Okay, next question. Do you think historically that the housing sector was more difficult to enter than other sectors?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Yes, of course. Do you think historically that the housing sector was more difficult to enter than other sectors?
What for?
I assume they're asking for women.
For employment?
Yes.
I don't think I've got the data to be able to answer that, but I do find it interesting that at such an early date, mid to late 19th century, there were already these attempts to open up housing management as a career for women. And I mean, another example of somebody who made her career in housing was Mary Smith. She was the second person to be appointed as a board member at Peabody. But I've read a chapter in a book that's all about her, which is very interesting, about her career. She married and had children. I think she was widowed at an early age. So she had to earn her living to support the family. And she went into housing management and became quite a distinguished person in the housing world. She's written books on housing, and by coincidence, there is a property on one of the Regency estates, the Millbank estate, which is called Mary Smith House, named after her.
Oh, wow. So there are some women that have been commemorated.
Well, of course, that's not, we didn't name it. It already had that name before Peabody acquired the estate, so we can't claim credit for naming a property after a woman, sadly.
On a similar theme, then, the next question says, do you think Peabody will ever have a woman CEO?
I'd like to think so.
Yeah.
There are plenty of other major housing associations who have had a woman as CEO, but it hasn't happened at Peabody yet, but I'm sure the day will eventually come.
Indeed. Can people visit the Ayers home, and do residents live there now?
Yes, it's divided into 4 flats, so it isn't possible to go and visit. I don't know about the interior, but I would imagine the interior has been changed greatly since, well, it's over 100 years now since it ceased to be the Ayers home. I don't know when any conversion into flats took place, but of course the interest will be in seeing the plaque on the exterior. So anybody will be able to go and view the plaque. But I've had to write to all 4 residents of the 4 flats there to let them know what is happening, and nobody has written back to object. So I hope they'll all be pleased. But no, it is people's private homes. It is really only a large house converted into flats. It's not like being able to go and visit an entire estate.
Well, that's good that people will be able to go along and see the unveiling. Final question.
I did see a question about what were charwomen.
Yes, I think
someone may have answered that.
But carry on.
Well, charwomen were women who went into other people's houses to do general cleaning. They weren't like live-in servants. They went round to a number of different houses and they did the most basic domestic cleaning. So you'd be a char lady and you'd have a round of homes that you went round to every week, and you did the cleaning, and you got paid a very small amount by each householder. But 100 years ago, it was a very common way for women to earn a living. I mean, some of those were heads of households, as you saw, and also you would have found back in 1911, which was the year that I took, that there would have been men who had got a job, some sort of labouring job, but also their wife would have worked as a charwoman, so supplementing her husband's income. It wasn't a lucrative job by any means, but it was a very common thing for working women to do.
Interesting. We've had a question come into the chat, and then we've got one more question in the Q&A box so far, but obviously if there's any more questions that anyone would like to ask, please pop them in there. It was mentioned that there may be a tour of the Peabody Historic Estates and sites. Is this still planned, do you know?
For me to do guided walks of estates, is that, yes?
Yeah.
Yes, I have done them in the past, and this was all pre-pandemic, and that all had to stop. And I have been asked to revive them. I was really waiting until we got through the worst of the winter weather.
Fair enough.
What with the gales and the rain and so on. But I have got it in mind to set some dates for. I've got 2 walks to do with historic housing, and there's a third one which is just around the City of London, where there's no housing, but it's where George Peabody had his business career. So look out for suggested dates and times for some guided walks once I've sorted my diary out, because also, of course, it will be not just for Peabody staff, but for Catalyst staff who want to learn more about our history.
Yeah, interesting. And how would people go about signing up to those once the dates are decided?
Well, I'll probably have to discuss that with somebody who will publicise it and take the signing up. I can't remember how we've done it before. As I say, the last time I did talks, walks was pre-pandemic, and I think I more or less ran my own sign-up lists, but I'll have to contact communications or something. I'm going to have to brush up on how we organise them before.
No problem.
Don't worry, they will be publicised so that people can have the opportunity to take part.
Nicola's saying that comms can sort you out, Christine, so
good.
I'm sure it'll be sorted. Great to see that we've got some Catalyst colleagues on the chat. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome. Final question in the Q&A box then. Do we know what happened to the women who worked for us during World War I, and what happened to them afterwards? And what kind of roles did they do for us?
Well, what we do know is that once their husbands came back from the fighting, they just went back to their domestic duties, and the husbands got the jobs back. What we should say, I mean, it's easy perhaps to denigrate senior management and say, well, they only employed men and they only employed women on a temporary basis when they were forced to, because the men had been called up for active service. What we shouldn't overlook is the fact that right from an early stage, Peabody had a very good pension scheme for its porters and as superintendents, and there were also widows' pensions. So some provision was made for them, and among the archives there are a number of insurance policies that were taken out in the names of women, and I think that those policies were taken out to ensure that they had a steady income after the deaths of their husbands. It's not entirely clear, but for all that the focus was on employing men, there was provision for looking after their widows if they died. And another thing that Peabody did back in the days before the National Health Service was that it subscribed to a number of hospitals, because of course most of big London hospitals, there was a fee to pay if you had treatment and so on, and so they were beyond the means of working people. But Peabody subscribed to a number of the leading hospitals in London, and that enabled them to get free places for treatment for both residents and members of staff and their families. And I do know of instances where members of staff in the past had sick family members who got hospital treatment that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to afford. So there were which they did look after their staff. So perhaps they were more enlightened than some of their contemporaries among employers at the time, even if they seem a bit backward by modern standards.
Yes. On the back of that, we've had another question around their payment. So were the women paid the same as their husbands while they covered for them? Do we have any information on that?
I haven't got any evidence of that, no, sadly. The employment records going back to the First World War are a bit scanty. We've got details of who applied for the jobs and which ones were successful. But I don't think we've got any information about the salaries. We know what the salaries were for the jobs, and I can't tell you that offhand, but the salary information will be there. But I don't think there's any way of knowing whether the wives filling in for their husbands got the same salary or whether they were paid a lower amount. I just don't know.
Interesting question, for sure. Well, thank you so much, Christine. That is the end of the questions that we've got for you. Everyone is saying thank you so much for all of the information. Everyone has found it really, really interesting. And thank you so much to all of our attendees. That's a whole lot of you. So yeah, thank you so much for being here.